welcome all those who are entering. I'm going to give us about 1 to 2 more minutes to allow people to log on. Welcome all. I'm sure people will continue to join us. I want to welcome you to our seminar presentation on design thinking. I had the privilege last year to sit and witness Victoria sharing with our last year's SENT cohort around design thinking. It was very interactive. Of course, we were in person in Scottsdale, Arizona. But of course, as we are in this season of pandemic, we learn to be creative. We learn to design and redesign new ways of interacting and new ways of presenting information. So I'm excited to hear this presentation. I'm excited for all those who are in the room, as you may be, some of you may be familiar with this particular topic, and some of you may have no idea what design thinking is. I believe that it's going to be crucial for your work as a social entrepreneur or as pastor, clergy, thinking about creating some type of new project, new outreach endeavor, that this design thinking will be central to your work. So I want to welcome you've already read her bio, Victoria, and now I'm going to allow her if she wants to share more about herself. If not, we'll jump right into things. But the floor is now Victoria's. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Darnell. I am really excited to be here today. As Darnell said, I loved doing the SENT seminar last year with the participants, and I have to admit, I'm disappointed that we don't get to do quite the same thing, but I do hope that today is meaningful and you walk away with some stuff that you can start applying and working with right away. But I hope that we can still have a good time today. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to use some slides to kind of walk through our conversation today. I really like pictures and I really like to kind of tell stories through what we're doing. And today's going to be pretty interactive as far as, as much as we can be online. So every few slides, there's going to be a question or a way for you to respond. And I want you to use the chat pretty liberally. So feel free to ask questions, have comments while we're going on. I'll have that pulled up while I'm sharing. And I would love for you to be responding in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now and make sure that we can all see what's going on. All right. Okay. Darnell, can you give me just a thumbs up that you can see what I've got here? Awesome. All right, so I'm going to pull up the chat. So if you have a specific question you want answered at the end of our time together, go ahead and drop it in the Q&A. But if you just have comments or you're responding to the questions that are in this deck, then go ahead and put them in the chat, because I have the chat pulled up and I'll be able to see it as we're going through. So I want to get started by kind of introducing myself. So like Darnell said, my name is Victoria San Esparza, and I have this really kind of weird background and intersection of my work. So I work part-time as a family minister here in Dallas, Texas. I work at White Rock United Methodist Church, and I work with our families, our youth, and our kids. And I'll be really honest, that's something I really love doing, and youth ministry was kind of the place that I started ministry. So I, like many of you, are in real life ministry contexts applying this work. In the rest of my time, when I am not working at the church, I run a consulting business called In the Water Designs. And really what we do is we are a design consulting agency for churches, faith leaders, and people who are kind of doing social work, really. And my passion for this work really started a few years ago. I have a master's of divinity, and I also have a master's of arts in design and innovation. And I stumbled into design thinking, or human-centered design, as we're going to talk about today, while I was in seminary, and pretty immediately realized that this was the thing that I felt like was missing from the church, that there were these huge gaps in the way that we think about innovation, that we think about change, that we think about what's coming next. And design thinking offered a process and tools and an entire world, honestly, for thinking about how we do new things in a different way. And so today, my goal is to kind of introduce you to the idea and talk with you a little bit about how I see this being applied right now. I want to, at the very end of our time together, I'm going to leave you guys with some really specific tips on how you can connect, you apply some of these methods to your congregations and your communities. I know that many of you kind of come from different backgrounds, like Darnell said. Some of you are in churches, some of you are in faith-based nonprofits or social entrepreneurships. So as you think about this, hopefully these things can apply to your context in different ways. And I would love at the end, if you have questions about its application, that you drop those in the Q&A, and I'm happy to answer them as we get to the end. So I want to start in the chat. Oh, before we start, I'm going to give you what we're going to cover today. So the first is we're going to talk about what is human-centered design. And hopefully you'll walk away from the conversation not only understanding what it is, but how you, as a person of faith, as a leader, as a community member, are a designer. So you are doing work to design things every single day, even if you don't realize it. The next thing is we're going to talk about how insights can help us produce better innovation, and really how do we get to insights that shape the way we do our work. So much of the work that I do for myself and with other churches and nonprofits is really about getting to something that maybe we've missed. And so the question is, how do we get to that thing? And so my hope is today that I can offer you some suggestions and tips to be thinking about that in a new way, so that you're really creating a space to have innovative processes and ideas as you're working through this content. And then last is I'm going to offer you 3 really specific tips for innovation. They will seem like maybe they don't have to do with innovation, but I promise you they will lead to new things if you apply them in the right way. So this is kind of where we're going today. So I want to start by asking, on a scale from 1 to 8, how well do you think you know your congregation? And if you're not in a congregation, like change that to community. So whatever your context is, the people that you work with currently, right now, during COVID, how well do you know people? Okay, go ahead and send your in the chat. I see some people coming in. Okay, we got a couple sixes. Anybody else? And I want you to be thinking specifically about, as COVID has affected our patterns and our day-to-day life, how well are we understanding what's going on? Okay, so I see somebody answered a 9. Love it. That is amazing. I got a 4, a couple 5s. Okay, so we're feeling overall more positive than not, but definitely feeling like there's room for improvement. Great. So the reason I want to start with this question is because I think it's really important that we are engaging in how well do we know the people that we're working with? Because at the heart of design thinking, at the heart of human-centered design is this question of what is the human experience? So I want to do a little bit of an exercise with you to see if I can get you to kind of come with me on this journey. All right, so in the chat, I want you to tell me, how do you feel parking your car here? Let's imagine this is your car. What words come to mind when you think about parking your car in this location? It can be one or two words, it can be a sentence. What things come to mind for you? What feelings come up? Okay, I'm getting some stuff in here. Too crowded, tire damage, bugs, mud, getting stuck. Hope it stays dry. Absolutely, yeah. This would be a nightmare if we were talking about rain, right? Okay. What about this photo? Do you feel better or worse? Better or worse? Okay, I'm seeing a couple of folks come in and say, absolutely not, much worse. Okay, we see some people saying better, better. For those of you saying better, would you feel better if you were trying to leave this parking lot? Chaotic. How far do I have to walk? Absolutely. Okay, for those of you who said that, if I asked about better, if you're coming back in and saying, no, I would not want to stay here if I was trying to leave. Okay, what about this picture? How do you feel now? Better or worse? Better or worse? Better. Yes. I want to park here. I'm seeing some, yay. I love it. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So I want to draw your attention to the fact that this parking lot and this parking lot are actually only separated by a couple of things. So this is flat and paved, but the big difference in this parking lot, I would actually say, are some lines painted on the ground. Now, there's no labels, there's no directions, there's no arrows on the ground, but somehow as humans, we know intuitively that lines on the ground mean that this is where we're supposed to park our car, that this is the space that we're allotted, and it creates an experience that is far less chaotic than this one or even this one. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today when I talk about design. Because so often people think that design means we're picking out paint colors or throw pillows or even doing something fun and exciting on the computer. And all of that is included in design. But the kind of design that I am really passionate about, that I am firmly a believer that you do, is creating experiences for people that affect how they feel and experience what you're doing. And I think parking lots are such a simple example of the way that design permeates our entire life. And when it really works for us, we don't even notice that it's there. But when it's not working for us, we find it frustrating, we find it chaotic, and we feel even a little bit lost. And so I hope that today, as we have these conversations, that you'll leave understanding how you are playing a role in the kinds of experiences that you're designing for people, and how you can be more thoughtful about creating those experiences so they actually make sense and really fit what people need. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and it says, it doesn't occur to most people that everything is designed, that every building and everything in the world is designed. Now, Bill Moridge is an incredibly infamous designer. He designed the first laptop. He was instrumental in the computer mouse with like the rolling ball on the inside. He's done a tremendous amount for technological design over the past 20 or 30 years. And I love this quote because I think that it draws out the essential everyday nature of design that so many of us overlook. We tend to not focus on design when it's working for us, that when it seamlessly transitions into our life or makes it easier for us, we're not as aware of what's going on. But when design is working poorly, it is a disaster. And part of the reason I'm drawing your attention to this is because each of us, no matter what you do, you are a designer. You are creating experiences for people that may be really great, or they may not be great. And so the more aware we become of our impact on people's lives and the experiences that we're having, the more intentional we can be about what we design for them. So this is a collection of art from an artist out of Greece, and the collection is called The Uncomfortable. And I really love this collection of art because none of these objects are real; they're all designed on the computer. But I think that it draws out the very intuitive nature of design. None of us have to be designers to recognize that every single one of these objects is fundamentally flawed, right? That it doesn't make sense to have a wine cup that is shaped like an egg. It doesn't make sense to have rain boots that are missing toes. And it certainly does not make sense to have a plate or a fork that's missing a middle. Because to each of us, when we look at these things, while you may have never gone to school for design, I bet that if I asked each and every one of you to tell me one thing wrong with each of these things, you could tell me immediately. Because humans are incredibly good at identifying when something does not work. And this is really important because if we are not thinking about these things on the front end, then I can guarantee you that people who are experiencing your content, your programming, whatever you're putting out there, they are thinking about these things, whether or not they realize it. And I think that this intuitive nature of being a designer, just being human and being able to identify what works for us, can play in our favor and against us sometimes. This is another example of a way that humans naturally make the world work for them. So I love this example because how many of you guys, I'd love to see in the chat, how many of you have seen something like this? Maybe on a college campus or at a park? Yes, or you can just put a quick yes or no in the chat. How many of you have seen like a self-made pathway where there obviously is not supposed to be a path, right? Yeah, it's totally common. I'm seeing a bunch of yeses come in. We're constantly seeing these things. And one of the things that humans are really good at, and sometimes to our detriment, is that we just want to make it work for us. That if we see something that is not intuitive or it seems like extra work, then we're going to carve our own path. We're going to literally walk through the grass so many times that the grass stops growing and it becomes an actual path for people. And I think that this is a really amazing way that humans adapt to what's going on around us. I think we've seen that in COVID. We've seen the ways that people who have said for years that maybe we don't know how to do things online or we don't have great internet, that suddenly we've all jumped to figuring it out. And I think that we have this resilience as humans. But as people who are designing experiences and creating community, we have a responsibility to be aware of these kinds of spaces that we're creating. Are we creating things that are maybe a barrier or a burden to people that they want to change? And how do we be more thoughtful about that? For example, this is probably my biggest pet peeve as an experiential designer, because I think that it is incredibly common. So I'm going to guess most of us have seen a door that is labeled push or pull, that maybe doesn't intuitively, we don't know that it's push or pull, right? So let me give you a scenario. Let's say that you are the business owner of this shop, whatever this store is, and you're building your business and you get this door installed and you don't think anything of it, okay? You're open for a few weeks and some customers start coming in, and you start realizing that your customers, their hands are full and they go to push on the door and it doesn't open. Well, they push on the door because the bar or cross is a pretty universal symbol for humans that we can push on the door. Somehow in our brains, we think bar cross, I can push on it. Handle means I pull. There's something about just the way that we've associated doors that we know to do this. So you've noticed that your customers, their hands are full and they're getting frustrated because they all push on the door and it doesn't open. So you as the store owner say, oh man, then I need to fix this. So what you do is you put a sticker on the door that says pull, right? Okay, but here's the problem. Instead of actually questioning why the door was ever built this way or installed this way, we've decided to put a sticker over it, which is more like a Band-Aid for the problem. And I think that for those of us, especially who work in churches, have inherited problems like this, right? You show up at a new church, you start a new job, and even if you're in the nonprofit world, you get handed all of these systems that really aren't working for people anymore. That you're noticing that people put a lot of stickers on the door instead of asking, why haven't we gotten rid of the door and put something new in place? And I think that this is really important because it draws out the fact that bad design is not just bad for the people experiencing. It's not just bad for your customers. It's bad for you too. Because instead of saying, let's just stop worrying about the problem, let's make it more intuitive for everybody involved so that you can be less involved, we create these systems in which we have to basically check all the time to make sure that they're still working and continue putting patches on it instead of just starting over from scratch. And part of what human-centered design says is that this is the most important thing that we can be doing, is questioning if this system really still works for us and what we need to be doing differently to make it work for everybody involved. So today we are going to be talking about human-centered design or design thinking. It goes by a lot of different names, and it is most well known, I think, right now in the world as design thinking, but you can Google both and lots of stuff will pop up. The terminology is fairly new in the world of, life. It's probably been really popularized in the past 30 years. It's been something that has been existed and being used for about 50. So young in as far as processes go and in the professional world. But one of the things that I quickly realized upon stumbling into human-centered design is that this does not exist in faith-based or social spaces, really. It's just starting to break into the nonprofit world, but there is basically nothing on the intersection of human-centered design and faith, or human-centered design and nonprofits. So you might be asking, what is human-centered design? To put it simply, human-centered design is an interdisciplinary methodology that aims to solve problems by going to the people who experience the problem and seeing them as the expert. Human-centered design says that through curiosity, empathy, and iteration, we can solve any problem because we are valuing the people who experience the problem the most. That instead of being experts on a particular field, that we commit ourselves to being experts on the people who are experiencing the problem. And by doing this, we're able to see the problem in a new light, potentially redefine what we think is actually even the problem, and allow the people who are experiencing the problem to be designers and creators alongside of us. So I want to know, how many of you have heard of human-centered design or design thinking before today? And if you've heard of it, I would love to know where you've heard of it, what context you've heard this. I know that some folks have heard of this in a couple of different ways. It is pretty popular in the tech industry. So if you have a background in IT, or you've ever done anything like web design, it's very likely that you've heard of this process. Okay, so I'm getting some mixed responses. We have some no's, got a couple yeses. For those of you who said yes, I would love to know about where you heard about this. Okay, so I'm here. Leslie Taylor says, I went to a workshop about 3 years ago when I was getting to think about admissions. Absolutely, that's a really great way of thinking about the human experience, right? And the admissions process can be really great or really bad. Okay, in the medical field, like person-centered care, I'll touch a little bit on some of the medical fields that are starting to use some of this work. Friends who are designers, user experience designers. If you know anything about the tech world, UI, which stands for user interface, or UX, which is user experience, those are the kinds of people who design apps or computer programs. A lot of times they're coders thinking about how people are experiencing a digital product. Absolutely. Yeah, the hatchery, yes, doing some work with them, absolutely. Okay, so I want to talk about 3 really big principles that are built into design. So I like to use this quote because I think that it draws out the simple but complex nature of design when we're thinking about what it means to design experiences and processes for people. So I love this quote. Ralph Kalpan is a really famous designer. He has done a lot of work, digital design. He's done some furniture design, some everyday kind of household products, but is also just well known for kind of his writing and critiques on design. And he says that design is a process for making things right. And the first principle that I want to draw out here is that design is a process. Because we only have an hour today, I wish that I could go into all of the nuanced detail of what the process is. But today I'll have to give you kind of a high overview look at it. And that hopefully some other time in the future, we can spend some more time together talking about what it is. Now, if you Google the process for design thinking or human-centered design process, you'll get a ton of images that pop up. And of the images that I have seen to conceptualize this process, this is my favorite, because I really love that this process is a figure 8 or kind of an infinity sign, because it signals, first of all, that this process is not a linear thing, that it happens in kind of a cyclical nature and that we're never really done with the work. Design thinking says that we start by empathizing. We start by getting to know the people who experience the problem. We want to know the detailed nitty gritty of what it's like to be the person experiencing the problem, how we can support you, what's going on, what are the things that we've missed. And by understanding empathy, we're hopefully gaining a new perspective on the problem that allows us to define and redefine the problem in a new way. That maybe if we think that the problem is A, that after talking to some folks, we realize it is A, but maybe B that we didn't think about is the bigger problem. So how do we solve for B and maybe see if that will sort out A? Once we've defined the problem, we can move into this phase of really allowing our creativity to shine, to take some risks by ideating and throwing out ideas that maybe seem wild or silly or maybe even some degree uncomfortable, because we're trying to make new connections when we think about the problems. When I teach this course over a couple of weeks, I have a course segment that I do. We talk a lot about creative confidence in this space and how creativity is such an important part of design thinking, because once we've redefined our problem and we start ideating new solutions, it's so important that we let go of the senses of judgment, or self-questioning, as we often do in our many jobs. We tend to be pretty self-censoring, and it keeps us from actually generating really great ideas. And design says that there are no bad answers, there are no wrong answers, that everything, even when we fail, is an opportunity for us to learn. And so as we're ideating, we want to select an idea that we think best meets the criteria of what we've heard from our users and what we have redefined as the problem. And as we pick that idea, we're going to prototype. And prototyping basically just means that we're not going to pump a ton of money into an idea before we've tested it. That there are ways for us to get our ideas out into the world without investing thousands of dollars or hundreds of hours into making it perfect. That sometimes just getting the idea into the world can be enough for us to say, this idea is great and we should invest more time and energy in it, or this idea is not very good and we should go back to the drawing board because we've gotten some real feedback. Once we've kind of determined what's working and maybe what needs to be changed a little bit, then we can move into testing, where we kind of put some more energy behind it, put some more funding behind it, and we're able to kind of let it live a little bit bigger into the world. But the amazing thing is that it doesn't just stop there. It's not a linear timeline. It calls us to go back to empathizing. So saying, okay, we've built this thing and we're testing it in the real world. Now, what are the people that we're designing for? What do they think of this? How are they feeling about this experience? Is it still working for them? And allowing us to constantly check in and say, is this still the right idea? I think that this is a really important part of the design process, because as we're seeing right now with COVID, so much is changing. And if we're not really spending the time to regularly do the maintenance of checking in about our programming, checking in about our services, checking in about just how we do what we do, then we're often missing something. Because the reality is, churches and even nonprofits tend to be super behind when it comes to thinking about the next thing. And so if we take this opportunity to really check in with people, to ask more questions, to get really specific, then we're able to say, hey, we're seeing this trend start to change. How do we tweak what we're doing and be ahead of the curve and be on the edge of innovation as people are saying they need new things? The second concept that I want to draw out is that design is a process for making things. I don't know about you, but I've worked in a lot of churches and I've worked with a lot of churches, and a lot of the time, and even if you're in a nonprofit, I've worked with some nonprofits too, we spend a lot of time planning out our ideas, which isn't bad. We really mean well by it because we want to be good stewards of our money, of our time, of the resources people are giving us. But here's the problem. Sometimes we spend so much time planning that we often forget to ever take our ideas out to the real world. And design says that one of the most important things that we can do is focus on the aspect of making things, of not sitting in a room as people with degrees or even experience, but taking our ideas and putting them out to the people who are affected by the problem. That when we spend our time wrapped up, more time in committee meetings than we ever do out in the world with our communities and with our congregations, then we're missing opportunities to get real life. Say, I love that idea, and that would be so helpful to me and my family. Or people to say, that's a good idea in theory. Let me tell you the 4 reasons why I don't think that's helpful for me right now. And it's not so that we can feel bad about our ideas, but it's so that we can get our ideas out into the world and be more efficient with the way that we test things. That when we have good ideas, that we really spend the time of getting them out quickly, so that if people can say, this isn't working for us, then we can move on faster. And when we spend more time focused on making things, of making our ideas tangible, then we're able to get that feedback in real time instead of waiting months after committee meetings and program meetings and all these things that we usually do to kind of get an idea out there. We can test it more quickly and say, hey, let's keep moving forward, or let's take a step back and go a different direction. The final concept that I want to talk to you a little about as we're doing this intro to human-centered design is that design is a process for making things right. Now, I really actually like this word, and it is challenging because we live in a world where right can take on a lot of meanings. I think that churches and nonprofits, we're constantly trying to get towards right. We're trying to make things better. We're trying to improve the lives of people that we're working with, make them feel more connected to themselves and their families and their communities. But here's the problem. Right, while it is an admirable goal, is also a moving target. And I think that's actually why I really like it in this phrase, is because it reminds us that right is not something that happens once. It's something that is constantly changing. And as designers, we have a responsibility to be following that moving target. Let me give you an example of how right has changed over the years. Okay, in the chat, I would love for you to give me a couple of words or a sentence or two about your experience in a hotel. It can be this hotel, any hotel you stayed at. What words come to mind when you think about your experience in a hotel? I'll give you guys like 30 seconds to just drop a couple of words into the chat. All right, so I'm getting a couple people are saying comfortable, relaxing. I'm seeing another relaxing, uncluttered. Yeah, that's a good one. Hotels are always really tidy, right? Like there might be a few things on the table or a few things on the thing, but it's not messy. It's not like our houses sometimes, right? Especially right now, we're all home all the time. Anything else that comes to mind for you as you think about a hotel? Overall positive, overall negative, what kinds of things? Vacation, yeah, that's a great one. What else? One more. Let's see what anybody else says. Noisy, yeah, noisy, absolutely. Hotels are not, they're a little bit unpredictable too, right? Sometimes they can be really great and really quiet. Sometimes they can be really loud. How much does that fruit cost? Absolutely, right? Like you open the mini bar and you're like, wow, that looks really great. I'd love a snack, but it's probably $12. Yeah, absolutely. Easy access. Okay, right. So overall, hotels are not bad places. That they're reliable. We generally know what we're getting. They're available in every city. And for the most part, we have a positive experience. But here's the thing, hotels are, they're fine, but they're not necessarily great, right? Sometimes you can pay a lot of money and you can stay in a really fantastic hotel. But for the most part, they're a pretty neutral to neutral positive experience. What if I told you that you could stay in this place for the exact same price? What kinds of things come to mind when you see this place? Okay, I'm seeing some wow, amazing, a great view. Anybody else? Would you rather stay here or the hotel? Okay, a couple people are saying exposed. Yeah, there are a lot of windows. There's not a lot of privacy. Absolutely. Okay, so this picture right here is a picture that I pulled off Airbnb. Now, I don't know if you know the story about Airbnb, but I think Airbnb is a really fantastic example of the way that right changes over time. So Airbnb started in an apartment in San Francisco when a couple of guys who were living in like a two-bedroom apartment, there were like four of them, realized that there was this huge convention coming to San Francisco and all the hotels were sold out. And these guys, I don't know how much you know about San Francisco, but it is extraordinarily expensive. And so these roommates all said, hey, we want to make a few extra bucks. You know what? These hotels are crazy expensive. I bet we could charge half the price, all pay for all of our rent this month, and have a really amazing like bed and breakfast, like give people a tour of San Francisco experience. They'll sleep on air mattresses, air, and will be a bed and breakfast, Airbnb. And so they did this and their guests loved it. I think they had like three people stay the first night on air mattresses in their apartment. And their guests left and they're like, this was amazing. Can I come back and do this again? People were like, you want to stay in an air, like on an air mattress? And what these guys discovered is that it's not that hotels are bad, but that there was a new type of traveler looking for a different kind of experience. That some of us, maybe not all of us, but some of us want a more local feeling experience when we travel. We want to feel like we know our hosts. We want to feel like a local for a weekend. Maybe we want to go get a few tips somewhere to go eat and, you know, where places are really great that maybe a local person knows that a concierge doesn't know. And so what they ended up creating was not that we got rid of hotels or that they were bad, but recognizing that that the most desirable kind of experience was actually moving a target. They could create a different kind of experience that might increase the kind of happiness and joy people might find from their traveling experience. And I think that this is such a wonderful example of what it means for us to say that some of the stuff that we've done in the past is really great. And maybe it's still worth keeping, just like hotels are. But maybe there's something extra, something new that we haven't thought of that could allow us to better connect with people and have better experiences with them that maybe they don't even know that they want yet. So this is just a handful of companies that are using human-centered design and design thinking all over the world. Human-centered design is a literal billion-dollar business. It is kind of the best kept secret in the world of for-profit industries, because what you probably don't realize is that literally every single piece of technology that you have ever put your hands on in the past 25 years, 30 years, has had a designer like this, focusing on experience, making that product better for you. I don't know how many of you have updated your new iPhone yet, but I am literally constantly amazed by the way that Apple is so predictive of whatever we need. That there is something about when I download that new update or I get that new phone, that phone just seamlessly transitions into my everyday life. That there are new features and aspects that I never thought to say, oh, I really need this. But as soon as they come out, I'm using them. And that is good design, because those designers have spent hundreds and thousands of hours talking to people like you and me who just use the phones, asking them about, what do you do on your phone? How do you use your phone? And allowing them to get a better insight to what they could be thinking of next, that maybe you haven't even asked for it yet, but as soon as you see it, it becomes something that is helpful to you and productive in your life. And good design functions in this way. It allows us to understand what people need and want on a level that maybe they can't even articulate yet. It's not to say that we're deciding what people need, but it is to say that we're listening well enough that we're hearing something that they may not even know that they're saying yet. And a good design allows us to implement those kinds of discoveries into our work. So I want to come back to this concept about human-centered, about designers and what they create. So there are lots of designers, like I said, who focus on building technology, who pick out paint colors for your room, who even build homes. And a lot of those designers are building specific things. They're creating nouns. They're product designers or architects or software designers, and they're creating things that we use. But the kind of design that I think that you and I are really involved in are designers who create verbs. So let me give you an example of what I mean when I say this. So this is a pretty standard MRI machine. And this is one of my favorite examples about the function of human-centered design. It comes from a book called Creative Confidence, and I'll share the information at the end. But this story is about how design can influence the way we build our ideas. So Doug Deitz in the early 90s was the VP of new product design at General Electric, GE. And they were piloting some of the first technology for MRIs. And 30 years ago, MRIs were very, very new. They were just kind of new medical technology. And Doug and his team knew that MRIs were going to be able to radically shape the way that doctors were able to care for their patients. I know some of you mentioned in the chat that you've heard about medical advancements using using human-centered design and processes. And this is exactly where it started for a lot of companies, was realizing that there are ways for us to be thinking about new technology that can shape the human experience, shape the way we care for our patients. And so Doug and his team installed just a handful of these new machines in the early 90s. And Doug really wanted to see what it was like for this machine to be working in person. So he went to a children's hospital and he sat with the technician in the back room. And he noticed that they were running behind. And so he turned to the technician and he said, hey, I see that we're supposed to start about 30 minutes ago. Is everything okay with the machine? I see that we're running behind. Is there anything that I can do to help? Anything that's working okay? And the technician said, no, nothing's wrong with the machine. This is like pretty normal for us. We generally run pretty behind. And he was like, can you tell me why? She was like, well, it's probably just easier if you just go in the hall and see for yourself. And so Doug steps out into the hallway and he sees this little girl crying hysterically on the floor with her mom, because this little girl is terrified of going into a dark room that's cold, by herself, having to sit still for 45 minutes to an hour while loud banging noises are all around her. This little girl's crying, begging her mom not to take her in there. She does not want to get the MRI. And Doug walks back into the technician room. He says, how often does this happen? And the technician said, this happens literally every time you run this machine. Most of the time, we actually have to sedate our patients in order to get a good scan, because otherwise they're moving too much. And Doug left that day and was completely defeated, because despite the amazing, miraculous advancement of this technology, it didn't matter. Because at the end of the day, they could not get the patient into the MRI for it to even be useful. So Doug went back to his team and started working with a bunch of designers who wrote the book, and started brainstorming, how do we make this work for little kids? And they came back a few weeks later, and this was the idea they had. This is the same technology, except this time they painted the walls, they hung a few things from the ceiling, and they put vinyl stickers on the machine. And they rewrote the script so that the technicians were not just telling the kids to lay still, but turning the experience into an adventure. Do you hear that? Do you hear that banging? That is a giant octopus going over our submarine. We have to lay perfectly still so that they don't hear us. Do you hear that ding, that bang in the distance? That's a pirate ship. We need to be super, super quiet so they don't hear us. And what they did was transform the entire experience from something that was overwhelming and scary for a bunch of kids into an adventure they were going to enjoy. And Doug came back a few months later to see how the machine, this new room, was working. And this time, when he left the room after the MRI, that went seamlessly, he saw a little boy walking down the hall holding his mom's hand. And the little boy turned to his mom and said, "Mom, that was so much fun. Can we come back tomorrow?" And this is the power of great design. The design is not necessarily the content that we're creating. It is, obviously that matters. But design is also the way we think about the experience that we're creating for people, how people are impacted by the thing that we're making. This is my favorite quote, because I think that we could be easily talking about any church, any faith-based nonprofit, any social organization. And it says, design relies on the natural human ability to be intuitive, to recognize patterns, and to construct ideas that are emotionally meaningful as well as functional. These are so, so important to me, because I can't think of a better two things to focus on than something that is emotionally meaningful and functional. That our nonprofits and our faith spaces and our community spaces, they should be emotionally meaningful. They should create connections and purpose and meaning and support and hope for the people that we're serving. But they also should be functional, that we shouldn't sacrifice how well they work or how easygoing they are or how well funded or sustainable they are, that we shouldn't have to pick between them. And design says that a good idea, something that functions for us, that is going to work well, is going to be something that is emotionally meaningful for the people involved and functional for the organization or the people involved. So I want to talk just briefly about what we can use this innovative process to do during COVID. Now, so many of us are facing dramatic changes in the way we think about our work, the way we think about our processes. And I really want to draw our attention today to talking a little bit about how we can use empathy to gain deeper insight so we can redefine the problems that people are facing, better understand. So I would love to know in the chat, what are some personal challenges that your congregation or community is facing because of COVID? And I'm not talking about what you as a director or an organizer or a leader are facing with your organization, but I'm talking about the people who are in your organization, in your congregation. What kinds of challenges are they facing right now because of COVID? Loss of fellowship, loneliness and anxiety. What else? What else is coming up? People who are having a hard time using Zoom and technology. Increased poverty. Yeah, that's a really big one right now, right? I mean, we have lots of folks who are out of work. We're not able to get around as easily, public transportation, all kinds of things going on. Discomfort or mistrust of Zoom, inability to eat together. Yeah, there are some really big like social things that we've lost. Yeah, unemployment, absolutely. There are some really substantial challenges that our congregations and our communities are facing. And part of the reason that I want to draw a little bit of our attention to this today is because by better understanding the challenges that people are facing right now, we're able to draw some deeper connections to maybe doing something new. Because as we better understand the intimate details of challenges people are facing, we are able to start thinking differently about the problems that we're trying to solve. I would say that 90% of the problems, maybe that's too high, maybe like 60 to 70% of the problems that are seen most intense right now during COVID, we don't normally focus on, right? That we do deal with poverty and unemployment and loneliness outside of COVID. That 8 months ago, we were dealing with that, but it's a different level right now, right? That there's a kind of intensity that's been brought up that we literally cannot escape and our communities cannot escape. So what do we do with that? What do we as leaders do with that information? So I want to talk very briefly about how insight can inform innovation. So there are really three components of what makes up good innovation. And the first is technical feasibility. So do our ideas, are they actually something we can do right now? A really simple example of this is where I live in Texas. It is not feasible for us to be meeting or gathering in person in any form. There are still really high cases here. Our county is still in the orange out of red, orange, yellow, green. We're still well in orange. And it's just not feasible for us to meet in person. So any ideas that require us to be together, off the table. The second aspect of good innovation is how viable our ideas are. And this speaks a lot more to sustainability, in my opinion. And that could be financial sustainability, and that could also be emotional, labor, intellectual sustainability. Is it viable for us to say that each and every single one of us is going to call every single member of our community every day? No, we do not have the emotional sustainability to do that. So any idea that requires us to do that many touch points is just not going to work for us. And the final one, most important one in my opinion, is human desirability. Is this what people need and want right now? And good innovation really happens at the heart of these three things. That when we are able to sync up these three circles, then we're able to produce something that actually feels new and exciting. And human-centered design says that we start with human desirability. And part of the reason that I asked you guys about both at the beginning and just now about your congregations and your communities is because it is more important than anything else right now for us to be in tune with what people need and what people want right now. And one of the ways that you can do that right now is by spending some really intentional time digging into the actual everyday lives of people around us. I know that we can't be in person and it's tough when we're not together to be able to get that kind of insight, but I want to offer you three really specific tips on how that you can gain some new insights as you talk to people and connect with them. So I want to ask, how often are you calling or checking in on individual members of your congregation or your community? I would love to know how often you are picking up the phone and calling, or I don't know, if you're in a place where you're maybe can be a little bit more socially distant and in person, are you able to see people more one-on-one or in small groups outside? How often are you calling people? And for those of you who are saying you are connecting with people, I'd love to know what percentage of your congregation or community do you think that you're connecting with right now? 10%, 50%? 90%. I'd be amazed if somebody said 100%. Like if you're doing 100%, like you teach this. This is awesome. Okay, so I'm seeing some people come in. So several times a week, calling about 60% of your congregation. Amazing. Small congregations, 75%. Awesome. About 30% outside of worship. Yeah, I would say that's probably where I'm at, truthfully, because it's really hard, right? We all have kind of like emotional drainage from probably trying to call everybody. Some of you guys are some major overachievers. Amazing. You're connecting about 75 to 80% of people. That is so awesome. So what I want to offer as we kind of wrap up our time together are three really big tips to make the most of the way that you're connecting with people. Right now, I think the most important thing that we can be doing is regularly checking in on our community members. And whether you're a nonprofit leader or a faith-based leader, they're calling people or creating some kind of system where you have other small leaders of your organization all delegated with calling a certain number of people or a certain group of people a couple of times a week or a couple of times a month is going to be really, really important. Because like we were talking about, as right as a moving target, moving targets are moving even faster right now. Because what was true and relevant to our people 6 months ago, as the pandemic was getting started and we were all kind of panicking, is not the same things that we're facing right now, right? That right now we're dealing with parents. In my congregation, probably a third of our families have parents that are also teachers. So I have a bunch of adults who are trying to manage like 40 kids online. And then they also have like 3 small children at home. And their needs right now are very different than they were in June. And so one of the things that I want to offer you are some tips to make the most of when you do connect with people, how you can make the most of that time so that you're actually gaining information that helps you start thinking about doing things new. So the first thing for gaining new insight is be curious. When you call somebody or you are giving a list to somebody else to call, give them some questions to ask. Don't just call and say like, hey, how are you doing? That's a great place to start, but let's get specific in that. Have some specific things you want to talk about. If you want to ask them about how connected they are, how lonely they are, what work has been like for them, what their daily routines have been like for them, how they're doing financially in whatever way you want to ask that. But being specific and curious. So trying to avoid yes or no questions, because what we're trying to do is elicit stories and emotional experiences so that people can share with us on a more deep level about things that are really happening to them right now. Because the more that you understand about their everyday life, the stories, the feelings, the better you can understand how this seemingly small thing actually has a really big, significant personal impact in their life. And when we allow ourselves to ask big questions, focusing on less yes or no, then we can allow people to share those stories with us. If you feel like you get stuck in a conversation, follow up their response with, can you tell me more about that? Say more about what you mean when you say it's been really tough to have all of your kids at home at the same time. Why is that? What's been going on that's made it tough? As people are talking about feeling lonely, asking them questions like, can you tell me a time when you did feel connected? Have you ever felt connected to somebody when you haven't been in person? What was that like? What made you feel connected to that person? Eliciting things so that you can better understand not only what they're thinking and feeling, what's going on, but ways that it plays into the broader themes of their life. Understanding what people need and want that they're missing right now, and having a frame of reference to compare it to at another time in their life can sometimes be really insightful to understand when this person says lonely, they're referring to this really specific thing that's missing from their life. So taking that information in. The second is listen to without offering advice. I think that we're getting a little bit better at doing this, in part because I think a lot of us are tired. Just personally, it's tough right now. But it's really important as we're trying to understand what people are going through that we are listening really deeply, and then we're not trying to solve the problem for them in that moment. Even if you have an idea to maybe make it easier for them, don't offer it right away. Listen and let them share everything they're feeling and their frustrations and what's going on with them. Because what happens is that it builds trust for them to continue sharing more openly and honestly. And if you have ideas that could be meaningful and helpful to them, write them down, because those are really great places as you're listening to people share that you might be able to fill in some of the gaps with your work, whether it's new programs or new ways of connecting people or whatever you might be. But listening and writing down that advice that you want to give them and seeing what it means to turn that into a solution that you can test later on. And the last one is I encourage you to take note of anything that is surprising to you. As we're doing this work, it is sometimes really tough because we all have a kind of bias that we bring to our relationships. We have a bias that we bring to when we design anything. Because each and every one of us has a particular place that we grew up, a particular kind of family that we grew up in, and a particular kind of experience that we navigate the world with. And so when we allow ourselves to say, hey, that thing that somebody said, it feels very confusing to me or surprising or even upsetting sometimes, write it down, because it means that something that somebody said does not make sense in your experience or your worldview. And that can often be very insightful when it comes to creating new things, because often the barriers, the blind spots that we individually have are because we don't have the experiences other people have. And when you come across something that somebody says or does that shocks you or confuses you or surprises you, it often means that you're gaining a perspective that you didn't already have. And when we're intentional about being actually aware of when those moments are happening, instead of dismissing them as weird or trying to rationalize them, we allow ourselves to create space where we can use that information to do innovative work and to actually test new ideas. Okay, I know that was a ton of information, but I want to open it up now a little bit to talk about some questions. I know we have about 10 minutes left, and so I want to be mindful of that. But I would love to know what questions are coming up for you guys. feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A. Either way works for me. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that I can, you can see my face completely. But I would love to know what questions are coming up for you as far as your organizations, or questions about how you might apply this. As you guys are typing in your questions, I'm happy to offer you some more resources if you want to do a little bit more reading. So the first is, I'll drop my website in the chat if you are interested in learning more about the work that I do. So part of what I do is I run workshops for people and help them walk through the process of design. I also do curriculum development, so working with leadership organizations to think about how do we train leaders in a new style of thinking, and new processes and problem solving. And then the last thing that I do is I do coaching. So whether that's a long-term thing or like, hey, we just need a little support right now and we just want to talk to you for an hour, I do that too. So if you're at all interested in that, I know that right now, sometimes just having a person to bounce ideas off of can be really helpful. I'm happy to connect with you in that way, and I'll drop those things in the chat. If you want a couple of books to read, Creative Confidence by Tom and David Kelly is a fantastic primer on design thinking and human-centered design. It is not a faith-based book. It does not make any explicit connections to nonprofit work or faith, but it is a really great resource in just learning more about the process, about what it looks like to do this work. And then the second book is called Design Kit, also by IDEO. And it's basically a book that's filled with a bunch of tools and resources for you to start practicing, gaining more insights, testing your ideas. Again, not built for nonprofits or faith-based organizations, but really valuable insights and tools for practice. So I'll go ahead and drop all this in the chat, and let Darnell jump in and while you guys, if you have any questions or anything like that.
So definitely want to make space for any questions. It says, can you repeat the second book? Any other questions you want to ask Victoria while we have about 4 minutes together? Definitely want to thank her for her presentation and for her being able to connect us to resources beyond this moment. I think I see a question coming in. Do you think surveys are helpful in this process, or do you find the one-to-one conversations best?
So I would say that surveys are helpful in that they can sometimes capture an audience maybe isn't as likely to just jump on face-to-face. Sometimes you can get a big swath of the audience. The challenge with the surveys is that when they are really detailed, that's when you get the most information, but the more detailed you get, the less likely people are to finish them. So there's this really tough balance where if you put out a really long survey, no one's gonna do it. But if you put out a survey that's too short, you're not gonna get enough information. So what I would say is that if you wanna do a survey, try to find something that's kind of in the middle. You always wanna do multiple choice or check the box. Do not do any fill in the blank. Nobody will fill that out. And I would keep it under 10 questions. I do think that more personal interactions are really helpful right now because the experiences that people are having in kind of the different life stages are pretty different. And one of the things that I would really suggest is that if you really can't make phone calls or you don't feel like you have a group that can help you do that call, that kind of individual touch points, is trying to sample your community in a way that is representative of every demographic that you have represented. So I'm thinking particularly age and life stage. So that's teenagers, youth, kids, young singles, young families, young marrieds, people who are recently lost a loved one, empty nesters, and then even retired people or widowed people. And if you kind of try to touch all of those bases, you're more likely to get the information that you need without calling every single person. But I would also encourage you that if you have a couple of really great leaders, especially if you're in a congregation, like at my church, we have a couple of ladies that are really connected to everybody who's over the age of 60, that we've designated them as kind of like our community leaders. So touching point with them and saying, hey, will you call these 10 people over the next 2 weeks? And then just connecting with that one person saying, hey, what are some of the things that you heard? Here are some questions that would be really helpful for you to ask that I'm really wondering. What did people say when you asked those things? What kinds of things did you hear? And allowing that person to kind of have some ownership in the process of learning and gaining new insight can be really helpful, and you don't have to do it all by yourself.
One more question maybe, and that is, can you say more about testing, especially testing in community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say prototyping is really the space that you want to kind of do a low fidelity, low resolution kind of idea, and that means that generally we're not going to spend a lot of time and money investing into making it perfect. I think a good example of this is, say maybe you have an idea for a new program that you want to try online. Commit to doing it for 3 weeks and say, hey, we're testing this new thing out. It's going to be 3 weeks. Here's what it's going to be. Here's how we're going to run it. And then maybe at the end of the 3 weeks, send out a survey or connect with some folks who participated and say, hey, how did that work for you? Did that help you feel more connected? Do you feel like you got some more information? Did the time work well for you? And try to get some feedback on how well it worked. And then once you have some of that information, you can then build on it and say, this 3 weeks really worked for them. They really liked the duration. So we're going to do 3 weeks on, and we're going to do 3 weeks off. Or people said this time doesn't work for us at all, or this content was not relevant to our life, or it was too heavy for us to do at the end of the day. Or we need something lighter and we want to involve our kids. Giving opportunities for people to be able to kind of add their input, and then you kind of pivot. So instead of committing to 3 months at a time, committing to a few weeks at a time and allowing the congregation or your community to have that feedback. And then once you feel like you have something that's solidly working, let that play out for a while. But after, set a time limit where you want to check in with folks. So maybe it's once a month, every few weeks, and ask them if it's still working for them, especially if you start noticing that there's a decline in attendance or participation. That's a really good indicator that something isn't working anymore, which is not necessarily a judgment on you. It just means that needs have changed. And so how do you adapt as those needs are changing, and really create something that is helpful for them as their needs change?
Thank you again, Victoria. Thank you all who have taken the time to engage this material. We ask you that you continue to engage this material via Blackboard, as well as brain dates, being able to maybe put some ideas out and be able to run those ideas among your peers. And know that even post-sit seminar that our social entrepreneurship program here at MBA, we are always excited and thrilled to be able to sit and listen and explore ideas and help figure out how we can connect you with the resources needed in order to test those ideas and make those ideas a reality. So if you haven't already, log into Blackboard, explore, connect with some people, begin to cultivate some relationships. There's a lot of exciting ideas in our midst. So thank you all. And if you're joining us for the closing session in 15 minutes, we invite you to just kind of decompress. A lot of information's come at you. Let's just connect with our bodies as we continue into our evenings. So again, thank you.